Chapter 27 of The Lone Ranger Rides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lone Ranger Rides by Fran. Chapter 27. Guns Talk Back. The murder-bent quintet went up the stairs like Indians stalking single file through the wooded land. Each man carried his gun in his left hand and braced himself with his right against the wall. They stayed as close to that wall as possible to minimize the creaking of the stairs. The only sound was a faint, leathery whisper from the dusty boots. Wallie cursed inwardly at his lack of foresight in not having his men go stocking-footed to the double murder. Wallie was in the lead, Vince in the rear. In this order they gained the upstairs hall. Any apprehensions Wallie might have had about the squeaking boots were dispelled as he drew close to Bryant's door. A resonant voice, undoubtedly that of the masked man, was speaking. Wallie felt no qualms of guilt or conscience at the cold-blooded ruthlessness of his plans. He hadn't the slightest intention of giving the men who were marked for execution a chance to defend themselves. The code of Western fair play was missing from Wallie's personality. This was to be no duel, but simply the extinction of two men whose deaths had become essential to his plans. Wallie halted at the closed but unlocked door and motioned Lonergan and Lombard past him. As the leader faced the door, those two were on his left, while Vince and Sawtell, guns now shifted to their right hands, stood upon his right. All but Wallie were balanced on the balls of their feet, tense and ready to charge through the door, but Wallie hesitated. He could hear the masked man's voice, with a vibrant quality, carrying through the door. He could hear, distinctly, each word that was said. The masked man was scolding old Bryant Cavendish. Wallie crouched and placed one eye close to the keyhole. The room, he saw, was dimly lighted. It was difficult to see details. The blankets were mounded on the bed as if they'd been pulled over Bryant's big body. On the far side of the bed, Wallie could make out a white sombrero, and judged that to be where the masked man sat while he conducted the one-sided conversation. Wallie now knew just where he should direct his men to fire when he threw open the door. He hesitated, listening to what was being said inside. "You're the most unreasonably stubborn old fool I've ever known, Cavendish." It was the masked man speaking. "It's high time for you to drop this false pride of yours. Admit you've grown old. Let someone help you." "Cavendish, all these murders are yours. I know you aren't the killer, personally, but none of them could possibly have happened if you hadn't been so foolishly stubborn. You'd never admit that you found it hard to walk. You thought you hid that fact, but you didn't. You didn't fool anyone at all. Then, when your eyes began to fail you, you tried to hide that fact, too. Why, right now, you're so nearly blind that you have to feel your way." Wallie heard a low-toned response from his uncle. Then the masked man continued. "All of those nephews of yours realized that you not only were incapable of getting about, but that you couldn't even see what went on. They felt secure in doing whatever they pleased, so they organized a regular crime ring here in the Basin. They replaced all of your former hands with crooks whom they selected. They let it be known in the right places that this Basin would be a safe hideout for men the law was looking for. You couldn't see what your cowhands looked like, so you had no cause to distrust them. You wouldn't go to a doctor and have your eyes treated and your sight improved because you wanted to conceal your condition." Wallie reasoned that inasmuch as neither of the two beyond the door was to survive much longer, he might as well hear what else this incalculable masked man knew. Penelope tried her best to find reasons for your unconcern over the way things were going here. She thought more of you than you deserved. She tried to convince herself that you were not aware of things, and tried to find out if blindness was the reason. She defended you when Yuma turned against you, and what was her reward for that loyalty? You turned against her, the same as you did against those graceless cousins. She was made to sign away her rights just as they were. Don't interrupt, Cavendish. I've more to say. Yuma felt that as long as you were alive, that girl would be guarded and protected. How wrong he was! But that was what he thought, and when I captured him, he tried to convince me that he was the leader of these Basin killers. He was ready to spend the rest of his life as a fugitive in hiding and keep the law off your neck. When I showed him the document that Penelope had been made to sign, he realized that he'd made a mistake. He saw then that the girl he loved could look for little enough happiness or security through you. Who, in the name of heaven, is this Andrew Munson? What do you owe him that you'd deprive Penelope of any future comfort in his favor?" Wallie strained to hear what Bryant's reply would be, but there was none. In the brief pause he heard the heavy, emotional breathing of the masked man. "It wasn't until this morning that I learned some truths," the masked man continued. "I knew that someone had slipped into this basin and murdered Gimlet, because the killer rode within 10 yards of me, but I didn't know who he was. Tonto was halfway up Thunder Mountain when this same man went by. It was too dark there for the Indian to identify him when he killed Rangoon. Then he went on to Red Oak, where he let Mort out of jail with instructions to kill you in your hotel room. You know what happened there. I told you how I shot him in the leg and how he was later stabbed to death. Since then, I've learned who the killer is. I told you about Tonto. He was here, waiting for the riders to come back from Red Oak. The trail from Red Oak is on hard ground, as you know. The trail over Thunder Mountain is marshy in a lot of places. The loam there is soft and black, and different from anything that could be found on the trail through the Gap. Well, Tonto watched when each horse came into the corral. He found one, just one horse, Cavendish, that had black loam caked to the fetlocks. He gave me the name of the man who rode and owned that horse, in a note which he left at the cave. That man is your nephew, Wallie." Wallie, listening, frowned heavily, and thanked his lucky stars that this man with such a keen and logical mind was to be killed. He would prove a dangerous adversary if left alive. "You don't believe me," the masked man said. "You won't let yourself believe or trust anyone, but I'll prove Wallie is what I've told you. If I can prove that, will you talk?" Wallie had heard enough. "Come on!" he cried, and threw the door wide open. Lombard and Sawtell plunged into the room and dropped to one knee while they opened fire. Lonergan and Vince were close behind him, firing over them, while Wallie remained in back. Guns crashed deafeningly in the confines of the room. The white hat near the bed became a thing alive, leaping across the room in crazy circles. The mound of blankets on the bed became a shaking mass as bullet after bullet bored deep. A score of shots roared in the blink of an eye. Then back talk, in the voices of six-shooters, came from a corner of the room. Sawtell's gun jumped from his hand as if by magic. His fingers were suddenly a bloody mass, at which the killer stared in stupefaction. More flames lanced from the corner, and Lombard's extended gun arm snapped as a .45 slug tore through flesh and bone between the wrist and elbow. Sawtell felt no pain in the heat of battle. Instinctive gunman that he was, he fell flat upon his belly, jerking out a second revolver with his left hand. Loud snarls and curses came from pain-maddened Lombard, while Sawtell took careful aim. He steadied his weapon at a point directly between the eye slits of the mask. His finger tensed upon the trigger. Then, suddenly, his arm dropped, his gun unfired. He went limp and slumped. In his forehead there was a tiny hole, but the back of his head was an awful sight where a soft-nosed bullet had gouged out his skull. Half-blind Bryant Cavendish fired at sounds with an instinct that was supersensitive. Somehow the old man had found one of his guns and cried aloud in savage hate as he rocketed shot after shot toward the doorway. "They're all agin me," he cried out. "I'll show 'em I don't need sight. I can locate skunks by smell." His gun whammed again, and death spat at the doorway. Wallie screamed his orders. "In the corner! Shoot 'em! Drill 'em!" He pushed from behind at the instant that the lawyer Lonergan took a bullet from the masked man's gun on the hand, and one from Bryant's big revolver in the belly. He pitched forward and fell across the writhing form of Lombard. Shrill yells and cries of pain rose far above Wallie's livid curses. The Lone Ranger snatched the gun from Bryant's hand. "No more shooting!" he cried. He leaped toward the doorway, head low, and charged. Vince had swung to face the surprise counterattack. His gun blazed, but the Lone Ranger was beneath the slug. He crashed into Vince with such force that the runty killer was fairly lifted off his feet and tossed across the room, while his gun was jarred out of his hand. Wallie, knowing his life depended on the fight, scrambled up from the floor. The thought of losing made him frantic as he swung his empty gun in a vicious blow at the Lone Ranger. The blow struck the Lone Ranger on the bandaged shoulder. A sudden stab of pain like a white-hot iron gripped his side as Wallie followed up his advantage. Still clutching the heavy revolver, he rammed it muzzle first into the masked man's chest. The Lone Ranger couldn't breathe. The blow must have broken at least one rib, possibly more. He felt his legs caving beneath him, while his brain fought valiantly against the dizziness that threatened to engulf him. He threw both arms about Wallie and locked his hands beneath his adversary's neck. He was falling, and helpless to prevent it. He was barely conscious of the fact that Wallie kept driving more blows to his stomach, blows that were too short to have much power behind them. Close to his ear he heard the other's voice as a meaningless jumble of hissing syllables. Somehow the Lone Ranger's weight threw Wallie off his balance, too. The masked man had the fighter's heart that dictates action after the mind has ceased functioning. A mighty heave, a wrench that split the half-healed wound wide open. Still falling, it seemed that time stood still, and split seconds were like hours, and then a crash. The masked man's fall was padded by the body of the man he fell on. His superhuman effort had thrown Wallie beneath him as the two went down. Wallie's head smacked hard against the floor. Now Vince had a gun, was on his feet, and coming close. His ugly face looked like a leering demon's as he raised his gun. The Lone Ranger rolled, and as he did so, drew his extra weapon. Two guns spoke as one, their muzzles so close that the flames were intermingled. To the Lone Ranger, close to acrid fumes and scorching flame, it seemed that hell had burst into the room. And then Oblivion. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Lone Ranger Rides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lone Ranger Rides by Fran Stryker. Chapter 28. Wallie Leads an Ace. Another gun full loaded with 6 soft-nosed slugs that'll blast your brains clean out in the back of your blasted head if you so much as make a move. These were the first words the Lone Ranger heard as he recovered consciousness. His body was a mass of pain, and each breath brought a stabbing sensation in his chest. He realized, but dimly, that Bryant Cavendish was speaking. He didn't know to whom. "You're stayin' right here till Yuma's had plenty of time to git here with the law, and if he ain't come by sundown, I'm blastin' the livin' hell out of you anyhow." Obviously, Bryant had the situation well in hand. The masked man edged painfully to one side and tried to focus his eyes on the scene about him. The bedroom air was heavy with the smoke of gunfire, and the light was dim. The floor resembled a battlefield. Wallie laid where he had fallen, still unconscious. A pool of red surrounded Sawtell's lifeless body. Lonergan rolled upon the floor, clutching his stomach and moaning hideously. The lawyer was dying, that was obvious, but dying in the most horrible and painful way a man can die, by bullets. Lombard sat in a chair, his right arm hanging limp and dripping red. His face was drawn with pain, but he was silent. Vince alone seemed to have escaped lightly. He had a handkerchief, a dirty blue one, wrapped about one hand, but this didn't prevent his holding both hands above his shoulders. The masked man struggled to his feet and almost staggered his way to the washstand. He somehow managed to splash water from a pitcher to the basin, then scooped handfuls of it to his face. "You all right?" Bryant Cavendish demanded. I'm all right. I don't know just why. I thought—" "Save your breath till you get enough of it to talk with. I can see good enough to keep these skunks covered. You shot Vince's gun out in his hand. I thought for sure you was a goner." The Lone Ranger heard a soft moan and turned to see Wallie recovering from the blow he sustained when his head struck the floor. Still unsteady on his feet, the masked man carried water in the cup and threw it on the other's face. Then he joined Bryant Cavendish after regaining his guns. He sat on the floor and reloaded. For the first time he was aware of the freshly opened shoulder wound. The blood was soaking through his shirt. His chest, too, bothered him, but there were other things of far greater importance than his personal condition. Wallie was sitting up with a dazed look in his face. "You," barked Bryant, "get over there and stand close to Vince." Wallie obeyed slowly. Meanwhile, Lonergan had ceased his cries. The Lone Ranger knew by looking at him that the man was dead. Then he heard Bryant scolding. "I had 2 guns," the old man complained. "I'd 'a' wiped the lot of 'em out, if you hadn't messed into things so's I couldn't shoot without probably hittin' you." "That's just it, Bryant. I didn't want them all killed. We want them alive to talk. There are a lot of other men on this ranch, and everyone has been working with these." "Where they at now?" "Outside the house, figuring that you and I are dead." "Skunks!" growled Bryant. Wallie appeared to have regained his composure. "What," he asked, "are your plans now?" "Shut up and you'll find out," snapped Bryant. "This masked man told me about you, you dirty double-dyed rat, but I wouldn't believe him. He told me that he'd said just enough to you so you'd figure the two of us had to be wiped out. Then he dragged me out'n my bed and packed me in this yere corner of the room and waited till you showed your hand. By God, I never got talked to in my whole damned life like I been talked to by this critter. Now he's showed ye up for what ye are, I reckon I'm to do some talkin'." "I ain't interested," growled Wallie. "Now look out here," broke in Vince. "I'm your own blood relative, Uncle Bryant. Don't uncle me, you weasel-faced runt. You was in on everything that took place. Only thing I don't savvy is where's Jeb?" "You'd better be interested in where Penelope is," suggested Wallie. "You don't give a damn what happens to Jeb, but if you're interested in that girl, you'd better be willin' to talk things over reasonable." "She's in the care of that Indian," retorted Bryant, "and a damn sight safer than she was around here with you crooks." Wallie nodded. "Suit yourself." The Lone Ranger said, "You were going to say something, Cavendish." "I was," said Bryant, "and still am." The Lone Ranger rose again, feeling slightly stronger, and while Bryant talked, did what he could to dress the broken arm of Lombard. "I got aplenty to explain," said Bryant. "It's as you said, I didn't want to let on that my eyes was bad, because I knew I'd be took advantage of by everyone, so I tried to hide it. I told Mort that I wanted a good lawyer to come here and help me make up my will. I didn't know anything about this Lonergan, except that he talked like he knew law." "He did," said the Lone Ranger. "I had him make out my will, and I signed it. When he read it to me, it sounded like I wanted it. The lying crook didn't say anything about anyone called Munson." "You don't know anyone by that name?" "No. When I told you I'd never heard the name, I told the truth." "What about the other document?" "I had Lonergan write that up, too. It's just like you said it was. I planned to have all these no-good nephews sign that paper. Penelope wasn't never supposed to sign it." "She wasn't?" asked the Lone Ranger quickly. "No, she wasn't supposed to sign that any more than a man named Munson was supposed to inherit my ranch. I left all I owned to Penelope. That's how the will was supposed to read, and that's how Lonergan read it to me. When I took Mort into Red Oak last night, these skunks seen their chance to make Penny sign that damn paper. I savvy what their dirty double-crossin' scheme was. I ain't no fool. Them crooks knowed that none of them could be named in my will without arousin' a hell of a lot of suspicion, so they put in the name of Munson. If you want my opinion, there ain't and never was no Andrew Munson." "That," said the Lone Ranger, "is about the way they planned it. They knew the claimant to the basin would never appear and they'd go on running the place in accordance with the terms of the will and using it as they have been for the past weeks in their cattle business." Wallie yawned in feigned boredom. "When you get through with all this talk, you'd better spend a little time deciding whether you want Penelope to live or die." The Lone Ranger said, "There's one more thing we haven't learned." His voice grew flinty. "Who was in the party that ambushed those Texas Rangers?" "What's the difference?" "Answer me." "And if I don't?" replied Wallie in a bantering tone. The masked man stepped back a pace and drew his gun. He held it at a hip, the muzzle pointing at the stomach of the other. "You saw how Lonergan died," he said softly. "It wasn't easy to watch." Wallie glanced at the gun, then at the masked man's face. He saw something in those steady eyes behind the mask that made him almost feel the frightful drilling of a slug in the pit of his stomach. I didn't know anything about it," he said. "Mort and Vince planned it by themselves, and—" "You damned squealer!" yelled Vince. "Go on." "Rangoon bossed the job." "You'd 'a' done it your own self," bellowed Vince, "if you hadn't been so damned yeller. All of us all the time had to take orders from you while you strutted around in fancy clothes." "That's what I wanted to know," the masked man said, holstering his weapon. "That's a confession," shouted Bryant, "and I heard it. I'll witness that in court." "But wait," fairly shouted Wallie. "You've nothing to gain by hanging us. It'll just mean that Penelope dies too. You don't understand." One of the windows in the room looked out across the basin to the Gap. The masked man had glanced toward this frequently throughout the conversation. Now he saw horsemen coming from the canyon. "Yuma will be here in a few minutes," he said. "He's crossing the basin now." "Then you've got damn little time to decide. I made arrangements in Red Oak, like I told you last night," Wallie addressed himself to Bryant. "There's a woman there that's agreed to take care of Penny and those kids. I didn't say how she was going to take care of her. It's Breed Martin's wife." "Breed Martin?" Bryant roared the name. "A skunk that'll do anything, includin' murder, for the price of a drink. Why, you—" The old man was trembling in rage, struggling to get on his feet. His hands were working as if his fingers itched to feel Wallie's thick throat. "That's just it," said Wallie. "I admit all you've said here. I admit it to prove that I was willin' to go to any lengths to have my way. I planned to be the richest man in this part of the country." Wallie's voice was shrill and getting shriller. "I wanted every killer in this state taking orders from me. I was going to control the state, and I wouldn't let the life of one girl stand between me and what I wanted. I told that redskin where to take Penelope. I described the house. He can't miss it. 2 hours after she gets there, Breed and this woman'll have everything all set to take her and the kids south of the border, and that'll be the last of 'em. You know damned well what'll happen to a girl as pretty as Penelope in some of them outlaw greaser dives. I told Breed and his wife to get her out of Red Oak and go and hide until they heard from me. They'll do just that. If I don't show up, they'll go on south with her." "Where's that hidin' place?" barked Bryant. "Where is it? Answer me, you louse." "Answer you and then go and get hanged? What do you take me for, Bryant, a damned fool? Not on your life. You've got to make your mind up quick." Hoofs clattered outside the house. Wallie glanced through the window and saw a score of horsemen coming close, with Yuma in the lead. "Quick!" he cried. "It's us or Penelope. You can put all the blame on the dead men. If me and Vince and Lombard can ride out of here, we'll promise that Penelope comes home before dark. Turn us over to the law, and I swear you'll never see that girl again." Bryant raged and stormed. His fury broke all past attainments. The louder the old man shouted, the more he said, the more poised Wallie became. During the furor, the Lone Ranger made no comment. The hoofs clattered in halting, and men's voices carried to the room. The Lone Ranger saw with satisfaction that the men with Yuma were not weak-willed deputies like Slim. They were grim man-hunters, Texas Rangers, and they lost no time in herding the men of the Basin into a close-packed group with hands upraised. A door was opened downstairs, and heavy boots clattered on the stairs. Bryant Cavendish, sweat dripping from his face, looked beaten. He cast an appealing glance toward the masked man. "I," he said, "don't have no choice. You gotta stand behind me. That girl's life means more'n these crooks' death. That skunk has played an ace." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Lone Ranger Rides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lone Ranger Rides by Fran Stryker. Chapter 29. An Ace is Trumped. The Lone Ranger closed the door. Wallie looked at him and smirked. "Now you're showing good judgment," he said. "I've got a story all fixed up. It'll put us in the clear and—" A shout outside the door. "Come in alone, Yuma," the masked man replied, stepping back against the wall. There was a hurried conversation in the hall, then Yuma came in. His face was red and sweaty. His eyes went wide with surprise at the scene before him. "Close the door," said the masked man softly. Yuma slapped it closed and then exclaimed, "What in hell's been going on?" He saw Bryant, then the others with their hands still held slightly lifted. "Yuma," the masked man said, "Jeb is about the house someplace. You might have a couple of the men look beneath the living room floor." "But what's been going on here?" repeated the big cowboy. "Has that old buzzard confessed?" "Bryant is in the clear. Get the story briefly. Wallie led the gang. Bryant's half blind, but I know of a doctor who can help him. Bryant didn't know what went on here. Penelope is supposed to inherit everything, but I have an idea that she and Bryant will be together for a good many years before there's any inheritance to talk about." Yuma nodded, still wide-eyed. He looked from Bryant to Wallie, then at the men on the floor. He said, "There'll be a nice hunk of reward money comin' for the capture of these critters." "I won't be here to collect any reward, Yuma. You helped capture them. Besides, you and Bryant can split the rewards." Yuma looked surprised. "You mean to say you don't want the reward money?" The masked man shook his head. Then Yuma saw his drawn face and the blood-soaked shirt. "Look here, you're hurt bad. You need some patching up." He stepped to the door. "I'll call the Rangers in here to take things in hand and see about you." "No, no," the Lone Ranger said quickly. "Tonto will be here and he'll fix the wound. It doesn't amount to much." "The hell it don't!" "There's something more important. Wallie was just trying to buy his freedom. He had Penelope taken to Breed Martin in Red Oak." "Breed Martin!" howled Yuma, following the name with a string of invectives. "Why that—" "Wallie said that Breed was to take the girl to a hiding place, and if he didn't hear from Wallie, to go on to Mexico with her." Yuma's face lost color. His eyes flashed angry fire in a look toward the erstwhile bandit leader. "And so he wants to be let go free," said Yuma with terrible coldness in his voice. "Where is this hidin' place?" Wallie spoke. "Do you think I'm fool enough to tell you? Not me. You let me go and you'll see Penny back here soon." "I think," said Yuma slowly, "you're a-goin' to tell where at that place is." He took one step forward, swinging his right hand in a wide arc. It landed open-palmed with a resounding slap on Wallie's cheek. "That," cried Yuma, "ain't even the start." He brought his left around to slap the other side of Wallie's face, and then began a dazzling sequence of open-handed slaps, each one delivered with a force that bounced Wallie's head from one side to the other. A blow with a closed fist would have knocked the killer out, and Yuma didn't want this. He slapped until the other's face became a livid mass of swollen flesh. He would have gone on until exhaustion made him stop, but the Lone Ranger halted him. "That's enough, Yuma, enough," the masked man called above cries of "Give him hell!" that came from Bryant. Yuma, breathing hard, stepped back. "That's just the start, you ornery rat," he gasped. "Now you speak up, or I'll wade in with more of the same." Wallie was reeling, clutching at a table for support. His eyes were red, and blood drooled from a corner of his mouth. "I didn't intend to let you go that far," the masked man said. "There is no need of trying to make him reveal this hiding place." "No need?" demanded Yuma. "No. Tonto didn't take Penelope to Martin's. He went to Red Oak and then followed you and the Texas Rangers back here." "I ain't seen him or that girl," argued Wallie. "Look out the window." The buckboard with its team still hitched was near the corral. The children were still on board. "Where at," cried Yuma, "is my girl?" "She and Tonto came into the house." Wallie had slumped to the floor and sat there completely beaten and wearing a dazed, bewildered expression. "Now listen to me carefully," the masked man told Yuma. "If the Texas Rangers see me here with this mask on, they'll ask no end of questions. I don't want that. I want to slip out of this house by the rear stairs. You can turn these men over to the law, and Bryant will tell the entire story." There was a hammering upon the bedroom door. "The Rangers," said the masked man softly. "Tell them to go back downstairs." Yuma shouted through the door. "Vamoose! I'll be down to meet you in a minute." "Don't you tell me to vamoose in my own house," a girl's voice retorted. "Penny!" breathed the big cowboy. "See if she's at the door alone," the masked man said while he still held the latch of the door. Penny's voice gave the answer. "Open up, you big galoot. Tonto is here with me. I've got to see that masked man in a hurry." The Lone Ranger told Yuma to stay in the room and bind the hands of the three prisoners. Then he stepped out to the hall. Tonto said, "Me watch for Ranger. Girl want talk with you." The Indian took a place at the head of the stairs to give a sign in case the Texans came up the stairs. Penelope clutched the masked man's arm. "Please," she said with intensity in her eyes and voice, "don't let them take Uncle Bryant away. I'm sure there must be some reason for everything. He's been like a father to me. He's been honest and good all his life. If he's changed, it must be for some reason. You promised me—" Penny held a silver bullet toward the Lone Ranger. "You gave me your word." The Lone Ranger took the girl's small hand in his and closed her fingers about the bit of precious metal. "Keep that," he said. "Your Uncle Bryant isn't going to jail. He's going to a doctor and have his eyes fixed up." Then I was right in the first place." Penelope's face lighted up with the announcement. "The worst crime of your uncle was his refusal to let friends help him." A new note came into the confusion of voices on the first floor. Tonto explained that Jeb had been found and was telling everything he knew about the others. The masked man listened for a moment to the heavy voice that told how Wallie planned to place the murder guilt on the masked man and Bryant. Then the bedroom door jerked open. Yuma came out like a charging bull and halted abruptly at the sight of Penny. Bryant, leaning against the edge of the door, stood right behind him. "You can't leave here yet," Yuma told the Lone Ranger. "I got them critters roped so they won't make no more trouble. Now you got to wait and listen to what Bryant's got to say." Yuma looked at Penny. Then his old confusion overcame him. He fumbled with the buttons of his shirt and barely raised his eyes above the floor. Bryant Cavendish went to the point at once. "You," he said to the Lone Ranger, "have got to stay here and run this ranch." The masked man shook his head slowly. "I won't take no for an answer. I've got to go and take a trip to get my eyes fixed up, and I can't leave this place with no one to run it, and no cowhands to run it with. We've got to get all new men and weed out the cattle that's been stolen, and see that the folks that lost their cattle are paid back in full for it, and no end of other things. Now you stay here and name your own price." "I can't do it, Bryant. Tonto and I must leave here." Penelope clutched the masked man. "Please," she said, "please stay." She looked into his eyes in a way that made big Yuma squirm. "Doggone," he said softly and wistfully, "if she ever said that to me, a span of wild horses couldn't drag me off this ranch. I'm damned if—" Penny turned quickly. "You," she said. "If you're to stay here, you've got to stop that cussing." "Huh? Me? Stay? I been fired." Yuma looked at Bryant. "Your uncle told me to get the hell—" "More swearing," snapped Penelope. Bryant broke in. "You look here, you big sidewinder. You was tryin' to tell me how this outfit should be run. You did a heap of braggin' and boastin' on how much you knowed, and now you're goin' to make good. I'd like to have that masked man stay and do the bossin', but I'd have to have you as well. If he won't stay, then it's you that'll have to do the bossin'. I can't stop the masked man from leavin', but, by damn, if you run out on me, I'll make you wish you hadn't." You mean I ain't fired, then?" Yuma blinked at Bryant, then looked at Penny and his face fell. "Aw, hell, Cavendish, I can't stay around here. That doggone pretty girl just ain't no use for me, and every time I speak to her, I rile her more. I reckon I—" "Yuma," said Penny sharply, "it's bad enough for you to swear like a mule skinner. Are you going to fib as well?" "Me? Fib?" "Blaming me because you won't stay here. Trying to say that it is my fault and that I have no use for you." That is—" "That's an out-and-out fib." Yuma's jaw dropped and he stared. Comprehension came to him slowly. It was incredible, unthinkable. You want me to stay?" he faltered. Penelope looked at him and spoke softly. "Please." She took one of his big hands in both of hers. "At least stay for a little while so I can tell you what I mean." Yuma let out a wild yell that rang throughout the house. "I'm a-stayin'," he roared. "She wants me to stay. I'm drunk. I'm a-dreamin', and I'll drill the critter that wakes me up." "Blast you!" bellowed Bryant. "If you're going loco, get those men downstairs first. Then I don't care what you do. Clear out my room, and after that you're running this place on your own." "I'm a-doin' it!" cried Yuma, dashing through the door. In an instant he was back with Wallie under one arm, Vince beneath the other, both kicking their legs and crying at their undignified position. At the stairs big Yuma met the Rangers coming up. "Here ye are, boys," he called heartily. "There's a couple of your prisoners and the rest are comin' pronto." He let go his grip, and the captive pair dropped to the stairs and rolled down part way, where the Texas Rangers caught them. It was then that Penny realized it. The Lone Ranger and Tonto were not there. Sometime during the conversation with Big Yuma, the two had slipped away. They hadn't gone down the front stairs. The Texas Rangers had been in that part of the house. Penny hurried down the hall to her own bedroom and looked out the window. It faced the same as Bryant's window did. There were two horses at the corner of the house, Tonto's paint horse and the big white stallion. She saw the masked man in the saddle, Tonto about to mount. The girl watched as the two rode out across the basin toward the distant gap. She felt that something vital left her as that masked man rode away, and yet she wouldn't have called him back. "Good-bye," she breathed. "Good-bye, my friend." The gap yawned in the distance, a colorful opening under a westering sun. Penelope's eyes were bright as she finally saw the two horsemen disappear beyond the bend. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Lone Ranger Rides. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Lone Ranger Rides by Fran Stryker. Chapter 30. The Badge of a Ranger. Riding through the gap at Tonto's side, the Lone Ranger seemed lost in his thoughts. His mood was one of introspection. He had no desire for money. He never in the least desired to own land and large droves of livestock and make deals with other men. His silver mine would still remain unworked. Why, he wondered, should men want to make a trade that was to any other person's disadvantage? True, self-preservation was the first law of life, but wild things of the forest interpreted that law of nature without greed or dishonesty. They lived by the rule of what was best for the greatest number. On the other hand, because men preyed on one another, should he turn his back upon a so-called civilization? The answer came to him then, clear and unmistakable. Since he had been a boy, the strong masked man had gone to nature for his education. Now, as a man unnamed, he would try to make mankind benefit by what he had learned. Tonto studied the masked man with grave concern. He had tried to persuade his friend to halt and let his wounds be dressed, but the Lone Ranger had refused. "We'll go on," he said. "There's one more thing I want to do." A period of riding in silence brought them deep inside the gap. Tonto asked no questions, made no comments. He simply rode in stolid patience, wondering if the Lone Ranger could know what he so desperately hoped for the future. The pledge the masked man had made had been fulfilled. Now the Lone Ranger could unmask, reclaim his name, and take his place once more with white men. Would that be his decision? Tonto wondered. The Texan reined up, then dismounted. He still breathed with difficulty, and his face was white and drawn. Hard lines showed at each side of his mouth as he stepped close to one wall of the canyon. Tonto recognized the place. 6 mounds of earth and stone were there, surmounted by 6 rough crosses. The Lone Ranger stood before the first of these and removed his hat and then his mask. The soft, warm light of the sunset brought a glow into the Texan's upraised face and wiped away the lines of pain and fatigue. His lips moved slowly, though the Texan's voice was silent. Then he dropped his eyes and whispered, "Bert." He moved to the next grave and paused there, whispering, "For you too, Jim." At the third small cross the Texan whispered, "Dave." And at the next he called to "Grant," then "Don." At the sixth grave the tall white man crouched and scooped aside the dirt and shale. He reached into the pocket of his shirt and withdrew a star of metal. He looked at it for just a moment. The badge of the Ranger caught the sun's light and sent it sparkling into Tonto's eyes. Then the Texan dropped the badge into the hollow he had made and covered it. Now he rose and faced the Indian. He nodded ever so slightly, as if he understood what Tonto hoped for and desired. A faint smile broke the corners of his mouth as he replaced the mask across his eyes. "A little rest," he said, "to give my wounds a chance to heal, and then we'll ride again." Tonto said, "Me know good camp. We go there? Tonto fix wound?" The masked man put on his hat and jerked it low. He placed one foot in the stirrup. "We," he said, "will go there now." He swung his leg across the saddle, and his voice rang out with a crystal clearness that carried through Bryant's Gap, echoing and re-echoing from wall to wall. "Hi-yo, Silver! Away!" Silver leaped ahead, his master in the saddle. Tonto rode behind and grinned in happiness, following the tall masked man whom he called friend. End of chapter 30. End of The Lone Ranger Rides by Fran Stryker. Recording by Roger Melin.